There's so many misconceptions about the Scopes trial, and I think it's because people experience it either through history textbooks when you're a kid, or through the play Inherit the Wind, which isn't really about the Scopes trial. It's actually a metaphor for what's happening in the 1950s, using the trial as a kind of a play through which you tell that story. So the most important thing to keep in mind about the Scopes trial is that there isn't one response to the question of human evolution. The real issue has more to do with where humans are coming from and how Genesis portrays that particular issue than evolution in general. And that it wasn't really primarily even maybe about religion. So there's so much going on in the 1920s US that have to do with who's going to control public education, whether a state has the right to dictate for itself or meet larger obligations across the US about what kinds of materials are taught, who's going to be invested in authority to be able to teach and or which materials you'd read. And you have a really wide variety of opinions about every single one of those points. So the Scopes trial ends up characterized as, oh, it's religion versus science, but it's also rural and big cities confronting each other. It's also the advent of media coverage of these issues. Part of what we're seeing are people across the US dynamic engaging, embracing, opposing the conversation about human evolution for reasons that have nothing to do with religion at all. So I really think the first step is getting into the Scopes trial. If you want to understand it, you want to demythologize it, spend some time really looking at the trial itself. What were the major issues at the time? Religion doesn't stay in its religion box, right? Religion is a word, and we use it as a way of describing categories of experience. But religion, as much as people like it to stay here, it actually intersects in really complicated ways with politics and geographies. And if you come to the Scopes trial expecting it to just be about religion, you're never really going to understand the complicated dynamic of all the network of things happening that dictated how people responded to, embraced, or opposed what was happening in this small town in Tennessee. So that's what I would tell you is the most important thing. If you really want to get outside the mythology, understand the complexity of religion, which we can talk more about, and then really look at the circumstances in the 1920s in the US and how religion engaged with other issues that were important to people at the time. We have this tendency when we're talking about the evangelical response to Scopes to generalize evangelical as if it's not a really complicated dynamic movement that not only had lots of moving parts but changed over time. So there isn't one evangelical response to what happened in Tennessee in the 20s. There are many, and they don't stay static. They change over the years. So if we're thinking about, there was already big conversations between evangelicals before this occurred in Tennessee about the role of evolution, about humans' portrayal within the context of evolution, about how science was or wasn't as a discourse threatening within the context of like modern American values, who was going to be more important within the context of the family or public discourse. So most important, I think, for folks is to get that, yes, I think it is true that many, many Tennesseans, as in the South, many Americans, would fall into the category scholars would call evangelical Christianity. But evangelical Christianity is not a denomination, it's a movement, and it includes lots of different denominations. And the opinions might vary depending on where you lived in the US, how big your community was, how your specific faith-based organization responded to these issues. So you've got people who are really bothered or concerned about specifically how the portrayal of the origin of humans is playing out, but especially concerned about how that's playing out in public life. So Scopes is as much about the discussion of religion in a public setting as it is about anything else. And the role education is going to have. So how are the kids in a community being introduced to materials, and different evangelicals have different opinions about the role of public education, what should be taught in a public educational setting, and how science, or specifically human evolution, falls into that. In Tennessee, there were a variety of opinions within the evangelical movement about the Butler Act itself. So not everybody before Scopes or after agreed or were comfortable with the passage of that law, even within the evangelical community. So I think a lot of times we use this word evangelical without the kind of precision that scholars use. If we can keep in mind that this is really a diverse and flowing movement and not a single static way of viewing either the Bible or the world around you, then not only do we have a greater appreciation for the complexity of different opinions and different responses, but we also aren't surprised in a negative way or accused of being biased against organizations, right? So we want to understand and embrace variety, not presume that groups of people all think the same way about something over large swaths of time, especially something as complicated as the Scopes Trial and Evolution. When we talk about religion and science, I think we have a tendency to generalize both terms. So we would have to, if we really wanted to investigate it with our students or in a public talk, we would encourage you to think about which kind of science. Like science is such a big word, right? Are we talking about applied science? Are we talking about theoretical science? Does it matter if we're talking about science as applies to the cosmos versus science that applies to vaccines versus science that applies to how the technology of your smartphone works? So I think it really depends on which science we're talking about. And we have the same tendency to generalize religion, which is that when people say religion versus science, they're often thinking of a particular religion or a particular denomination. Are you only thinking of Christianity, or are you really thinking about how Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, indigenous traditions deal with the same topics? So we tend to take what we're most comfortable with as humans and then make that emblematic of that whole big word, religion. But the truth is, it would really depend when you're talking about these mythologies, about which religion, in which place, under what circumstances, and with which communities. And the most important thing then is if we can get that science is complicated and religion is complicated, then we immediately have to embrace the fact that it's not always a relationship of opposition. That there are many, and maybe even most cases, in which people who identify themselves with a religious organization or a faith-based lifestyle are totally fine with the vast majority of what we do scientifically. And in fact, engage all day long, every day in their regular lives with the outcome of scientific research. So then specifically, when we frame things as religion versus science, I think we are importing a certain kind of predetermined notion about what both of those terms mean. And a lot of what we do in higher education is think for ourselves and with our communities and with our students, what do we really mean when we say this word? Can I assume that just because you and I are saying the word the same way, we mean the same thing? Or do I need to be very careful and specific and engaged with you so I know when we're talking to each other what we mean? And then we start to see that things that might have seemed oppositional, like religion versus science, might not be as oppositional as we first thought. When we're thinking about how to productively talk across disciplines and communities, I think it's really, really important if you're interested in the intersection between religion and science. Whether you think of that as opposition or whether you think of that as collaboration, never begin with the presupposition that you know the background of the person you're talking to. So you could have somebody who's very interested in religion who isn't themselves committed to one particular religious worldview, and you could have somebody who's an excellent scientist who is themselves a person of faith. So I think always if we want to start dialoguing productively across fields, I think we first of all make sure that we're not making presuppositions about the background of the person with whom we're dialoguing. And I think it can feel scary. It can feel scary to encounter new ideas for the first time and in a setting where you don't maybe even have prior relationships for the classroom, right? I want to make sure my students don't feel scared when they walk in to ask questions. Cross-disciplinary conversations can, as much as they are exciting, also feel very scary. I think going back through the history of science and thinking about the number of people who have made significant contributions to scientific discourse, including in the fields of evolutionary biology, who are themselves very active in a variety of different religious traditions and faith-based communities, and who don't see that as completely divorced, right? They don't see their own world as, well, my religious persona is here and my science persona is here. There's lots and lots of really good work out there, actually, on the research telling us how best to communicate across religion and science, specifically in the education of evolution. And at UT, our science faculty have done really great work bringing folks to campus to have that conversation. How do we best talk to people from different backgrounds, thinking about the responses to different kinds of scientific theories like evolution? How do we make sure that we're doing that in a productive way that doesn't feel scary and shut us down, but allows everybody to engage in their own sort of exploration, right? So that's I think my concrete answer to how do you do that is you start by really thinking about the assumptions you have about another person before you engage in the discourse, and then keeping in mind that lots and lots, a lot of people don't see even evolutionary biology as somehow separate from or against or contra to their own religious experiences or the mandates of religious communities.